I have 7:01. I'm going to go ahead and call this meeting to order. Will the recorder please call the roll?
So since we're starting off as a joint work session, I'm going to call roll for counselors and then also commissioners. Starting with Counselor Urban,
Here.
Counselor Merriday,
Here.
Counselor Stennett,
Here.
Mayor Soulsby,
Here.
Commissioner Ashley. No. Regal? No, thank you, Eric. Commissioner Christopher,
Here.
Commissioner Burbach, Commissioner Burns, Commissioner Monroe,
Here.
Commissioner Parsons.
Here.
All right. Mr. Monken.
Good evening. Thank you, Mayor, Council, Planning Commissioners, for joining us this evening for our first work session to discuss the Cottage Grove Economic Opportunities Analysis. This is a DLCD funded project that will look at the next 20-year planning horizon for economic development, both where and how, but policies as well. We're currently about a third of the way through the effort, and this is just a good check-in point to provide information to both of these bodies so that as things move into the next phase where it becomes more what kind of policy choices the city should adopt or consider to adopt moving forward can be considered as part of the plan in general. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Beth Goodman from Eco Northwest. She is our project manager and has worked on several projects for the city of Cottage Grove over the years and has a pretty good, darn good understanding of where we are and what we can do here. So.
Thank you very much for having me here. I'm gonna see if I can control this. So I'm going to go through a presentation. It's sort of a selection of information in the Economic Opportunities Analysis, the EOA. Ms. Mayor, do you want to stop me when people want to ask questions? I want to try to be respectful of your time.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Certainly. All right. So you did last an EOA, an Economic Opportunities Analysis, in 2009. I was involved in that project as a very young planner at that point. You see some of the key strengths and charms, strengths and challenges from that EOA back in 2009. A lot of those haven't necessarily changed at this point, but you've got some updated information in this Economic Opportunities Analysis. So we're doing this in part to comply with legal requirements of Goal 9. You're not forced to do this at this point. You're not required to do it at this point, but it's certainly a good thing to do periodically to help you understand your existing conditions and to forecast future conditions that can inform your economic development strategy and your land use policy strategy. And help you with economic development coordination. So in the end, we're doing this in part for legal requirements, but also so the city can continue to plan for economic opportunities. So the products of this will be an Economic Opportunities Analysis, an EOA report. It's kind of long and for a lot of people a little bit boring. And that will be something that you can adopt as a technical appendix to your comprehensive plan. So if there's any changes to comprehensive plan policies, certainly that's supported by your EOA. And later, if you want to say change zoning or change comprehensive plan designations, that EOA supports those kind of changes. And then we'll also have recommendations for comprehensive plan policy changes and actions to implement those policies. So what are you going to do to take advantage of your economic opportunities? So our schedule has us finishing this up in early 2025. I'd say we're on target to doing that. We've had one meeting with our advisory committee to talk about some of the basic information that we're going to be covering this evening. They had some good input for us that helped us update some of what we'll be talking about this evening. We'll be meeting with them again here in the fall to talk about some of the policies that I'm hoping to get input from you all on. So one of the key parts of an economic opportunities analysis is the buildable lands inventory. It looks at all land within the urban growth boundary that has plan designation of either commercial or industrial. So you can see on this map, it's essentially a comp plan map of your employment lands. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to identify land that is potentially buildable. So we start in part looking at constraints, so things that would make it more difficult to build. So obviously things like your 30-year, your 100-year floodplain, your floodway, areas that have landslide susceptibility or steep slopes, some other types of constraints. We consider those constraints as prohibitive. So even if you have land that is vacant in those areas, if it's constrained, it's not considered buildable. And in the end, this is your inventory of buildable land. You got a little bit of industrial land, about 42 acres inside the city limits and 18 acres inside the urban growth boundary, but not in the city limits. It's scattered, it's small. You don't have a lot of it. You've got some commercial land and tourism commercial land. Again, it's scattered, it's small, you don't have a lot of it. And when we get down to the end of this, when we're talking about policies and what the city might do, you've got some options. Some of them are difficult options. So we'll talk about those options at the end. But in the end of this, you've got about 64 acres that are buildable within the city limits and 26 that are buildable within the UGB, but outside the city limits. So about 90 acres of buildable land. You don't have very many larger sites. You've got hardly any larger sites. When I say larger, I mean larger than 2 or 3 acres. So you've got a constrained land supply. Before I go on, are there any questions about the buildable lands inventory?
Any questions?
Okay, I'm going to go on. So then you talk about the other side of this. That was the inventory of land. Then you start talking about what are opportunities for growth. So I'm not going to go through all of these different trends. Let's just say in the EOA, we're looking at really broad trends to start off and thinking about how those trends may affect Cottage Grove. So these are a couple of the trends. The one that I think is most interesting here is increases in automation. So you're seeing AI expanding automation possibilities and lower and middle wage jobs that are higher risk from automation. But then you also see the aging population. It's driving the need for replacement workers. So across Oregon, this is true, and it's certainly going to be true in Cottage Grove. So even though you may not have as much growth in employment, you'll still have demand for new employees. In other words, it's going to be hard for a long while to find people as people continue retiring. So transformation of the retail sector is one that is particularly interesting, especially for smaller towns like Cottage Grove. So, you know, you've got the growth of e-commerce, which I'm sure that is not a surprise to anybody. That's been doing an interesting job on our smaller local businesses. When you're less a part of a big urban area, in other words, you're not that close to Eugene and Springfield, for instance, there's a certain amount of concern about your commercial and your retail areas, wanting to retain them so that you can continue having those goods and services available locally. Increased remote work trends. There's a lot of variation on what's going on there, but it certainly seems that the pandemic has loosened things up and made it more possible to work remotely, at least hybrid, for a lot of jobs, not all of them. So going on to a little more information that is very specific to Cottage Grove. What we're showing here is the change in employment in Cottage Grove within the urban growth boundary between 2007 and 2022. We chose 2007 because for Lane County, that was the top of the last economic cycle before the downturn. And what we see is that Cottage Grove increased the number of jobs from about 3,200 to about 3,600 over that period, a change of about 442 jobs. You saw a decrease in some industries like manufacturing, and increases in industries like healthcare and social assistance. So a lot of these areas of growth and decrease are ones that we're paying attention to when we're thinking about what your future opportunities are. So we're not saying that the past is certain of the future. We're saying what would Cottage Grove need to do to change the past or to change the future away from the trends we've seen in the past. And the lines that are highlighted in blue have above average wages. So part of what we're thinking about here is the types of industries that have the most potential growth in Cottage Grove. So manufacturing, you saw that that was something that decreased, but it is an industry that has a high concentration and higher wages in Cottage Grove. And so some of the questions we ask in the economic opportunities analysis is what can Cottage Grove do to support growth of manufacturing? Healthcare and social assistance, again, that's mostly healthcare really. High concentration, growing employment, oftentimes higher wage. Also, you need more healthcare as people age so that people are able to age in place and have healthcare options here in Cottage Grove rather than always having to go up to Springfield. And then services for visitors and tourism. Those are things that are important really for our quality of life.
Counselor Meredith.
Thank you. I was wondering where the mill jobs would fit in under this. Is that under manufacturing? Or?
Yeah, mill jobs would fit in under manufacturing.
Thank you.
Counselor Sennett.
Thank you. I saw relative to the numbers, a pretty high increase in information jobs. Can you talk about that?
Yeah,
And, like,
information, is that an interesting one? For a lot of places, what information is things like information like ISPs. In other words, internet providers, that kind of thing. In some places, information is data centers. That's obviously not Cottage Grove. You had a growth of 14 new employees in information. So it's not a large amount of growth, but it's a larger percentage change because you started off only with 21 employees in that. In
So this would be
2007.
maybe people that work for our cable providers, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, could be.
Okay.
It could
Thanks.
be.
So what do you find with, I'm looking at the healthcare and social assistance,
Mhm.
high concentration on growing employment, but we're struggling to find people to fill those
Oh, yeah.
positions. So,
And so that I think goes to workforce training. And of course, I don't think I brought this slide with me, but Cottage Grove is part of larger regional area. So my sister-in-law and brother-in-law live here and along with my niece, and none of them work in Cottage Grove. One of them works in Crestwell, two of them work in Eugene. So there's people in Eugene who commute to Cottage Grove. There's a lot of people in Cottage Grove who commute out. So I think this is part of a larger regional problem. Really, it's part of a national problem of being able to find enough healthcare workers. And so in a lot of ways, the solutions are solutions that are much bigger than necessarily just Cottage Grove. They tend to be things like working with places like Lane Community College on workforce development. And so the areas, if you're looking for areas of action, and I haven't thought through this very much, but would I think be through more regional economic development agencies. In other words, working with them on, workforce development initiatives. And if that's an area that you'd like us to look into a little more, we certainly can.
thank you. Counselor Meredith.
Coupled with that is workforce housing as
Yes.
well. We have a very tight housing market, and I know South Lane Mental Health, Peace Health, and the South Lane School District all have difficulty finding housing for their employees.
Yes, sir. When we did the city's housing needs analysis, I want to say that was back in like 2017 or 18. Part of what came up in that is the school district owned a piece of land, which I believe they have been developing. So one of the recommendations out of that was working with the school district to support development of that land for housing for people like teachers, other people to live and work in Cottage Grove. You've probably heard that we have a housing crisis in Oregon and across the US. So this isn't a unique Cottage Grove issue, but some of the solutions can be very local solutions like that one. Continuing to work on housing issues, especially housing that's affordable for people to live and work here, is going to be important. I think a couple of slides ago, we said that the average wage in Cottage Grove was $41,000. Can't remember what Lane County's average is, but I'm pretty sure it's above that. But if you think $40,000, that's pretty close to $36,000, which is close to $3,000 a month, which if you spend a third of your income on housing, roughly $1,000 a month, how many housing units can you think of that are affordable at $1,000 a month? I'm willing to bet that there's not a lot.
The school that was developed is currently market rate apartments, well over $1,000. So, and with no path to ownership. So.
Certainly, and I could take you off onto a long detour around housing. I'm doing a lot of that work around the state. I don't necessarily think that you want us to do that at this meeting. But there's quite a lot that can be done, and I think some opportunities that will be coming more out of the state in terms of funding to support the infrastructure that you need for housing and to support development of housing that is income restricted and more affordable. Are there any other questions before I go on? Okay. All right. So part of what we have to do in the economic opportunities analysis is figure out how much growth we may be talking about in Cottage Grove. Here we're presenting you with 3 different potential growth scenarios. One of them is based on the idea that Cottage Grove's employment grows at the same rate as population through 2045. That's a little less than 0.5% per year. That would result in 410 new jobs. It's not necessarily unreasonable to expect Cottage Grove's employment to grow at least that much. Another assumption would be about historic growth. So Cottage Grove grew at about 0.86% between 2008 and 2022. And that would result in about 900 new jobs over the 25-year period. Or to assume that Cottage Grove is going to grow at the same rate as Lane County, which is about 0.94% per year. That would be about 986 new jobs. It's a little bit of an optimistic assumption because growth in Lane County is driven by growth in the Eugene-Springfield area, given that they're the regional employment centers. But you can certainly assume that. My advice to the city so far has been that the population growth rate, that's a little slow. I would expect Cottage Grove to grow a little faster than that. So I think we've been proceeding with the historic employment growth rate and the regional employment growth rate. I don't think it really matters a lot which of those two you settle on. They're really similar sorts of numbers, but figuring that you're going to grow by at least 900 to 1,000 employees over the next 20 years, those are pretty reasonable assumptions. And when you look back through 2007, you grew by 400 and some employees, and that's a little longer. I can't do the math in my head. It's a little longer than a 10-year period. Comparable to the way you've been growing historically. So we've run our numbers out and proceeded with that. Yes, sir.
Councilor Irvin.
Thank you. Given the initial opening of the constraints that we have in terms of buildable land lots, where does that factor in with the expected growth rate? We don't have a lot of area to expand. We can't take on one new company that's 400 employees kind of at one time at this point.
So that's some of the policy pieces. The short answer is going to be you're probably going to need to look at redevelopment opportunities. We'll talk about UGB expansion at the end of this. It's challenging. And I've been very cautious, and now that I've looked at it on the maps, more cautious about trying to lead the city down that road. And if I may, I'll explain that when we're staring at the maps, if that's okay.
Wondering if that was taken into consideration, that whole southern interchange and those properties down there?
That's some of the problem.
Okay.
So. All right, so let's say you grow by somewhere around 900 to 1,000 employees. What we're seeing is that under any of those scenarios, you've got enough land to accommodate expected growth, but sort of just barely. You're short on commercial land, you're tight on industrial land. You don't have many sites that are bigger than 2 acres. And for commercial, you have no sites that are bigger than 10 acres. You've got one site that's 10 acres. It's bigger than 10 acres. It's about 14 acres. It's a little constrained by the Willamette Greenway and the floodplain, and I believe that there's ongoing discussions about developing that site. So I won't go into those discussions because I'm not privy to them. So there is an opportunity on that site. And if I'm remembering correctly, Eric, that is a site that the city took some actions to make sure that there was opportunity for development of it. That's an example of things that the city may need to do in the future where there's opportunities. So it may require some amount of public action to support development, even of things that are, medium to modest sized. All right, so the economic development discussion. So I'm going to pop up a slide in a moment about Cottage Grove's advantages and disadvantages. And this slide is based on our observation and our understanding, but also discussion with city staff and the advisory committee. So our question for you, is there anything major that is missing in terms of advantages and disadvantages, or that you think we've gotten wrong on the next slide? So I'll actually walk through this. So advantages, you get your transportation, your rail, your local airport, small town charm. It sounds small, but it's not small. It's, well, I'm staring at a big plaque that says All American City. So that's what it says it all. With that is your higher quality of life, your access to recreational amenities, your high quality of school and secondary services. You've got an opportunity zone here that may provide some support. You've got regional economic development advisors, economic development agencies that support entrepreneurship, such as RAIN and your small business advisories. You've got your existing workforce and your existing employment base. Those are pretty important advantages. There's probably a number of other advantages that we haven't stuck on here because we only had so much space. But for disadvantages, right there at the top is, well, we've called it lack of available industrial land. I would say it's lack of available commercial and industrial land. Your housing, in terms of affordability, conditions and inventory, you just don't have enough that's affordable for people to live and work here. Limited access to childcare and quality of childcare services. That's not unique to Cottage Grove either. That's something we're seeing stress on across the state, of course. Lack of entrepreneurs. So that's an interesting one, certainly. It's something that it may well just be the people who, settle in Cottage Grove aren't necessarily the crazy inventors, essentially. You may have some crazy inventors, but it's not an area with a large concentration of that. Absentee ownership and developable owner areas without engaged property owners, I would say, like if I was ranking these things in importance, I would say that's one of the more important things, because you've got land in your UGB that does present redevelopment opportunities. But of course, when you're talking about development of privately owned land, the landowners have to be engaged. So that's a difficult one. Limited access to capital, that one ties back to entrepreneurship. Basically in Oregon, if you're not in Portland, there's just not great access to capital, which is, I think, unfortunate. Limited transit opportunities and partial access on the Southern I-5 interchange. That one's also a disadvantage. So I'm going to stop for a moment and say, are there any advantages or disadvantages that you don't see on the list, realizing that we've listed these out very quickly?
Well, I would definitely go to all of our outdoor activities, our waterfalls, our lakes, our bike paths.
Recreational amenities, yeah.
Our covered bridges. It's
Yep.
probably got to be top of our list.
Local beauties. Uh-huh, and
Our,
I've enjoyed a number of those.
Our historical, we're a mining town. It's our movie history in this town. There's
Mhm.
so much in that realm, I think that we should work off of.
These are good ideas, yes. Along the row.
Counselor Irvin.
The schools and the advantages, I was kind of questioning if we're talking about specific to Cottage Grove or broader that would bring people in. So here anecdotally, through presentations on the Lane Economic Committee, that it's a challenge even for U of O with their new prototyping program to get talent from across the country, because when they're bringing early 30s in that are just graduated or doing postdoc work, they look at the education opportunities in the area, and as a country, competitive in the country, we're not in that. So I wonder, when I look at that and you're talking about workforce development, I always go back to the education system. You know, what are we doing? Who are we turning out? Entrepreneurship is kindled, you know, in
Mhm.
early age and the like. So I would generally put that as like a disadvantage on the national level, how we compare.
And that I would say is really based on what we've heard from other people. So we can certainly list it as also a disadvantage.
I would also go offer our wineries. We're right in the
Yeah, I was thinking that.
Willamette Valley, and I think that's a huge advantage that we are missing out on here if we don't highlight that. Counselor Mary Day.
Overall location. It's close to the coast.
And we do have that one in, just not enough room for it. I love that about this place.
Commissioner Monroe.
I don't know what happened to it. At one time, we had quite a project of bicycle. I don't mean the normal thing that they do here, but we had routes figured from here to Oak Ridge
Okay.
and beyond. And then it suddenly phased out. I don't know what happened.
So regional bicycle connections,
Pardon me?
regional bicycle connections, bike path connections.
I don't understand the question.
Regional bicycle connections.
Yeah, you could, what we got done, you could leave here and go to Oak Ridge, go clear around to Lamola on the other side and wind up down on the coast if you had the time and the effort to do it.
Okay.
There's not many places, not only in Oregon, but on the West Coast, you could do that.
I have it down.
Counselor Stennett, did you have something?
Thank you. I'm not sure if this is the right part of your presentation. I'm not sure if it's an advantage or a disadvantage, but it would seem to me that we could do a lot more to encourage remote work. If you can work anywhere, then quality of life is going to go a long way in determining where you live and work. So there's a lot of opportunity for growth there.
Certainly there is. And the term for that is like a Zoom town, essentially. You might be in the middle of nowhere, but if you have a good internet connection and a good quality of life, then you can certainly attract people who are a little more footloose.
So I would say we could stand to do better, and that might be a disadvantage at this stage, but that's just my sense of things.
So on my next question about policies, I would like to hear about how the do better part. So
Yeah.
more coffee. Yeah, everybody needs more coffee. Any more comments on advantages or disadvantages?
Commissioner Christopher.
I'd like to emphasize that you have small town charm, and we're looking at growing a lot. We need to make sure that we do not lose that small town charm. Because if we grow too fast, we're going to lose it.
Mhm,
That needs to be, it's second on the list, so it needs to be high.
mhm.
Too much growth, the town won't be small anymore.
Commissioner Monroe, did you have something?
We have one other advantage that a lot of cities this size don't have, and that's water.
Yeah. And we have not talked to Faye yet about that, but we will be. So, and
Counselor Urban?
wastewater too.
I'm sorry.
Also,
Yeah, right.
I really think we went through a sequence here a few years back, this, all these wetland projects.
Mhm.
There's a piece in this town that sits right next to Bohemia School that nothing is done with. I've had to use my own money to keep part of the fire danger down. There must be close to 20 acres or more, I don't know. But it's a fire hazard. And the Gates property that connects to it, if they start dealing with that, I think things will expand, maybe clear through to Gowdyville.
I think that property may be a residential property rather than a commercial or industrial property. So getting that taken care of and not a fire hazard in the same way is, I think, going to be about what do you need to do to support housing development there.
Counselor Urban?
I would support from kind of both of those sides, but add more detail to them. I agree. The water aspect, when you have a river that can be developed, that it frankly isn't. And not only, a couple different forks of it potentially, that can be a huge draw in economic and destination style draws for one of the things that we do have going for us, which is tourism and just location. And the disadvantage of being in the forest, speaking of fire danger, is is wildfire.
I live in South Eugene. These
Yeah.
last few weeks, it kind of.
Yeah.
All right.
And we know with the, all the smoke that we have, that pushes tourism out.
All right, I'm gonna keep it going on then. So then, let's see. So what types of industries would you like to see growth of in Cottage Grove? And what are the barriers? What actions should Cottage Grove take to support economic development? And how should the city position itself for future growth? These are the questions that we'll be talking about in this next part of the project. And I'll flip to one other slide and then I'll come back and give you some potential ideas for actions. So in our advisory committee, we talked a lot about urban growth boundary expansion. The advisory committee was saying that, you don't have enough land, and if you don't have more land, you can't grow. Well, this is a complicated set of maps. The map on the left-hand side is a map of constraints all around Cottage Grove. So you've got, of course, the rivers, your floodplains, that kind of thing. The red and the orange are your hillsides, where you've got either steep slopes or landslide hazards. You can see that you're hemmed in pretty good. So that is a problem. When we lay that on top of the types of zoning that you have out in the county beyond the city, the orange color is land that is in exception zoning. And so that's zoned for rural residential, rural industrial, rural commercial, those kind of things. And then you have the light green and we'll call it a teal color. And those are farm and forest. In Oregon's land use system, when you do an urban growth boundary expansion, you first have to consider areas that are unconstrained in exceptions land. And then you can consider areas that are for farm and forest growth. Farm and forest land. But it's hard if you have a lot of exceptions areas around you to get to the farm and forest land. Well, when we think about this, if I was really thinking about what are your economic opportunities, I don't want to be sticking up here by the North I-5 interchange. On this map, you can see all the hash marks. Those are all constraints. You got to avoid the constraints. Well, what do you have up next to the I-5 interchange? You've got good resource land. You can't go there very easily. When we spin around your UGB, you've got, constraint, constraint, constraint. Then you've got some areas that are separated from the city by some constraints that are off of, what's the name of the park? Thank you, Robb River Nature Park. You don't want to go through a park to get to an industrial area or another commercial area. It starts getting pretty far from I-5. So you swing down to the south part. You've got some more exceptions areas. If you could see these in the map, you would see that the parcels in a lot of these exceptions areas are small. And so that's problematic. And so you've got some other exceptions lands that, could possibly be developed in the south part of the town. But you're there along that I-5 interchange. That's a partial interchange. That's not a great area for economic development either. And then, you side up the western side of the town and it's really constrained. Where you've got some exceptions areas, they're connected with existing residential areas. You don't want your industrial land to be adjacent to your residential areas, especially when it's at the edge of town. And they'd have to come through to get to 99 or to get to I-5. This is a way of saying with really geeky maps that any UGB expansion is going to be difficult. It's going to be expensive. And I don't mean the cost of hiring consultants to do the expansion. That would be expensive also, but it's the cost of getting infrastructure to those parcels and finding parcels that have the characteristics that you need, that are relatively flat, have a highway connection, and aren't on good farm and forest land. It's going to be really difficult.
Councilor Urban?
Jumping back real quick to advantages.
Yes, sir.
Proximity to rail.
Yep.
I didn't see that on there.
It's an advantage. It's less of an advantage than you might necessarily think. The industries that like rail are those that have to ship commodities.
Lead credits.
Big things like logs or wood that aren't going to rot if it takes a little while to get them there. So that's an advantage of our region of being able to do that. The constraints when talking about that partial intersection, and you've got far more experience in this, what's the chicken and the egg? Is it you build around it and that necessitates ODOT to come in and supply that demand? Or it's a real chicken and egg. You're not on ODOT's list of interchanges to upgrade in the next 20 years. I don't think that you're going to attract the businesses that would need to be there to support an upgrade. So you really need the infrastructure in before you do the upgrade. And I know, I'm not looking at ODOT's list all the time, but I've looked over their list for other cities farther north in our region. And there's some really compelling areas that there's just not funding for it. So you could say, if you're looking at this in a 50-year viewpoint, that wouldn't be a bad area to look at. But if you're thinking about it in the 20-year, I have concerns about setting the city up for expectations that aren't realistic in the 20-year.
Mr. Stewart?
I'd add to my experiences is if you look where the interchange is, there's resource land there. There's agricultural land there. That is very difficult to make the case to create in the urban growth boundary and to change that zoning. So when I was a commissioner, Coburg tried to do that and didn't prevail. The state forced them to look at the orange areas, and the resource land is last, even though that resource land was right next to their city hall and right in the center of their city. The state's land use laws were requiring them to build around that area and focus on the orange exception areas that are already developed. So it's a really tough challenge, and it was very expensive, and Coburg, appealed it, fought it, and lost all the way in the end. So
So they are zoned things like rural residential, which isn't very interesting for you guys because you don't need residential right now. Rural commercial and rural industrial. So those are the types of things that are in exceptions land. So I mean, I've given a lot of thought to, what should I advise? And knowing that this is an easy thing to advise, oh, do a UGB expansion, it'll be great. Except I've done, I don't know, a half dozen or more UGB expansions. They're never great. They're always, how do you help the city expand where it actually makes sense to expand? Because oftentimes that isn't where Oregon's land use system will take you. So I'm just very hesitant to set a city down that route when they do have some other options that look harder, but I don't think are harder. So
Thank you.
certainly. So I'm gonna flip back to the previous slide, or maybe Eric will push the go back button. So things that you could look at. Cottage Grove has quite a lot of redevelopment opportunities. You've got old commercial areas that are underutilized, perhaps not utilized at all. You've probably got some industrial land where that's the case. I haven't looked to see if you have any brownfields. Okay, so no identified brownfields. You've been talking about an urban renewal district, that goes along what's the name of that street that heads over to I-5 that's right across the way from here? Main Street. That would be that one. Yeah, Main Street. Duh. So that goes along Main Street. It would be really smart to think about those things. They're less exciting than a UGB expansion, but you've already got some infrastructure there. You probably need some infrastructure upgrades to support redevelopment and heavier use. But there may be some instances in which those infrastructure upgrades are less cost prohibitive than infrastructure upgrades at the edge of town. And of course, your public works director is here and could speak to that more intelligently than I could. Looking at partnerships. So how can you make it easier for businesses to do business in Cottage Grove? Part of this is going to be about staff capacity. If you want to support businesses and want to be more business friendly, you have to have people for them to come talk to at City Hall. And how do we get things accomplished more easily? Looking at code changes, say that allow a wider range of use in some areas. You may want to do a commercial and industrial code audit to look at your zoning code and make recommendations for changes. Those are all some of the kind of things that Cottage Grove could do. What we'll be doing next is we'll be talking more to your advisory committee about these things, and probably talking a lot about UGB expansion, because I'm not sure that my arguments are going to be compelling. But I'd like to hear from you all where you'd like, if you have thoughts about where you'd like us to spend some of our effort. And that's my last question for you.
Any comments or questions? Counselor Stennett.
Thank you. I wonder, do we have an inventory of rentals, hotels, houses? Simply lost a rather key hotel in our system, and it kind of, it clearly has implications for tourism, but also visitorship for work. And
we don't officially have an inventory of hotels. It wouldn't be all that hard to say what hotels you have here. We couldn't say anything about employment or anything like that, as long as we could observe the hotel by walking around. I've got confidential data that I have to be careful about quoting anything from. But we could talk about that. Houses, no. We don't have an inventory of that unless you're looking at housing that's used for short-term rentals, and then the city may well have short-term rental information. One of the issues that has come up is need for another hotel. And you don't have a great site for that. And so what would you need to do to have a better site for that? It's got to be a 5-acre piece of land or so, give or take a little. It should be somewhere that you can get to it pretty easily from I-5. So not down by the southern interchange, but up by the northern interchange. I at the risk of getting run out of town, I've looked at some of your recreational opportunities up north. And said, you've got a big golf course up by there. At some point, could you use that land a little differently? It would require certainly some important changes in public works to do that, because you're using it currently with wastewater. So I think those are some of the hard choices.
Can we grow that incrementally through kind of more boutique stays, beds and breakfasts, et cetera, as we don't have a large option for them?
If you had people who wanted to run a bed and breakfast, then I imagine you could. So looking at things like Airbnb and that kind of thing, you have the balance of, what does that do to your rental market for long-term rentals? That takes housing out of your long-term rental market. It puts housing into your short-term rental market to support tourism. There's very much a trade-off there.
Commissioner Parsons.
So have we started to make an inventory of what land is available for redevelopment? Like one big piece I think of is the old Price Chopper building that's been sitting empty for a very long time. Because if the expanding the growth boundary doesn't make sense, it seems like that needs to become a priority.
So what I would say is we never map redevelopment opportunities unless they're like publicly owned and have been discussed as a redevelopment opportunity. Because at a certain point, it's kind of rude. And I wouldn't want to put somebody's land on that sort of, that kind of map. But we could have some qualitative discussion about that. And one of the actions out of this could be about the city identifying those kind of redevelopment opportunities and seeing it where you've got landowners who are open to the idea.
Anyone else?
I just wanted to add in a little bit of info. We were talking a little bit about redevelopment and our urban core with Main Street, and as Beth pointed out, with the potential for an urban renewal district and the agency being reestablished. One of the other aspects of this particular project funded by the state is to do a mixed use housing analysis. And so I just wanted to put this into the room so that you can understand it as you might be thinking about some of the bits of this presentation. I'm sure you just will not drop it until the next time we talk about it. But is that what we're doing is we want to look at how our current code may or may not be potentially handcuffing that redevelopment or development potential in general. And so what we're trying to do is look at ways where we can identify and target some of our existing commercial lands that may be eligible under the current code to become maybe just all residential. An example of this would be the Pine Springs development there at Village Green. That was all commercial tourist land, but the current code allows for the property owner or an applicant to apply for a master plan development. And if they meet the criteria and the planning commission approves it, it can go forward. Well, then all of a sudden we've taken 7.96 acres of potential commercial redevelopment land and removed it as a commercial opportunity. And so we're part of this effort, which is outside of the goal 9 findings that this report is going to put together, but will be for the council's consideration and policy decisions, is, okay, how do we then further amend our code to protect the limited resource that we have by identifying some areas where it's like, okay, we'll make it pretty easy to do a mixed use development here, or maybe more heavy straight residential use here, because logically with the growth patterns that exist or with services, et cetera, it makes sense. And then where are other areas where we're just going to say, no, it needs to be commercial in order to protect our limited supply. So that's just something to kind of think about as you're, thinking about what kind of policies you want to move forward with. Is okay, that's a tool in our toolbox that is being developed. And other tools like that can be developed also in order to kind of facilitate that redevelopment effort, such as with the urban renewal district or an overlay district that kind of drives the code in a different direction.
Counselor Merida.
Thank you, Mayor. If informing an urban renewal district, can you bring in or incorporate into it the funding for a staff person that has been noted in this study and the others as well that would help facilitate business development?
Mayor, Councilor Merida, yes, you can. So there'll be a presentation before the council in November on this matter. But yes, you can utilize the tax increment that is pooled, if you will. I don't know if that's the best word, but you can utilize some of that increment for administrative cost. And so for Cottage Grove, the max under the current model, the maximum indebtedness for the proposed district is about $68 million in 2055 dollars. Right now, we're running through different models on what that should look like, making sure that we preserve enough money for admin, for projects, for gap loan program, for land acquisition, right? Multiple tools. It's not just all projects. But yes, that being said, in the first years of TIF, the first 5, that extra bit that you might earn from the district could be $20,000, $30,000, which isn't necessarily going to fund an FTE. It probably would more likely be well suited to fund something in finance where they could maintain the paperwork for the district. There's an annual audit that's required. Now, by year 10, when you've actually started to see an increment come into play, and instead of 20 or 30,000, it's 200 or 300,000, then you're looking at that ability to borrow. But certainly that's based on a 10% model of the 68 million. So 6.8 million over the life of the district, 30 years. If you go too much higher, then you're doing fewer projects. And so you kind of start cutting against yourself. So long answer, wanted to put it out there, but yes, you can use it to pay for staff to make those deals, bring people in, facilitate the function of the district, but it's got to be for the district.
Now, that seems to be the missing key that has been mentioned in a number of studies.
Any other questions? Counselor Sennett.
Thanks. With regard to remote work, I wondered about maybe potentially looking at expanding our fiber backbone, access to more higher speed internet. And when we looked at the constraints based on land use surrounding the city, we saw a lot of farm and forest land, and it naturally made me think about turning that to some kind of advantage. I mean, how do we encourage employment in farms and forests and use that money locally? Is that a sort of a dead end proposition, or what do you?
Well, I mean, you could encourage more farming and more forestry practices, which sounds really dumb to say. But you can't do, you could have a winery, for instance, but you can't necessarily have, any sort of urban use out in the farm and forest area.
Well, sure. I mean, I just,
A wedding venue, that kind of thing, sometimes on the edge of what you can get away with.
it just seemed like those opportunities in proximity could be, I mean, that's how we grew this town, is through farm and forest development.
Yeah, and the other thing is a lot of that's not really within the city's control because it's
Sure.
outside the city.
Makes
So,
sense.
partnerships. But I don't have a good answer for you right now, John, but I can look into
Just
it.
a notion. I
Mhm.
appreciate it, the effort. Thank you.
Counselor Urban.
Thank you. Just thinking of the avoid list, and just in fairly recent history, what do we want to avoid in developing? Certainly chemical spills, things that are, going to cause a degradation to the things that make this town charming. Overly concentrated industry,
Mhm.
to where you put yourself at risk for them pulling out and and leaving a ghost town. So, diversity and resilience and in the work opportunities. And just general fume, the things that make it pleasant, smells, sights, people,
So avoid pollution.
in general. Yeah.
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 I won't disagree with you.
All right. Is there anything else?
Yes.
Commissioner Monroe?
One big problem this city has got to overcome. It's called the Lane County Transportation Board. You send representatives up there to try to get somewhere as far as the roads here. And you get beat out by Eugene because they want a bicycle project. The question came up, and 7 or 8 years ago that I was part of, that we finally got this piece done from Woodson Bridge to the overpass. I asked him, why did you pave clear from Crestwell to the Cayuga Grove city limits and then stop, go to the other side and pave it on out to the interstate? And their answer is, well, we can't afford the Americans with Disabilities requirements. There's got to be some waiver somewhere there. They said the one piece, the rest of it's in great shape. I said, I did research, and from Woodson to Main Street was built in 1932. And it's not been improved since. And from there down to the city limits was 1936. And a lot of the places you'll notice where it was concrete, when they did a project, they said, there, it's fine. Now it's sunk down and you got just as bad, just like a pothole. Without good transportation, all the hope and things you want to do, it's going to be a fight.
I would say that infrastructure and quality infrastructure is the most expensive and the hardest piece of this, which is one of the reasons I embrace urban renewal, because it is something you can use to fund that.
All right. Well, we really thank you for all your hard work on this and appreciate it.
If you
All
go
right.
to the next slide or two, you'll see our next steps. We'll be coming back to you is the point a little later on this year, probably.
If there is nothing more, we'll go ahead and close this work session.
Yeah.
Roll me over, I'm done.
Do we want to take a little break?
Yes. Tell John to check.
We'll be starting the council meeting in just a few minutes after a
When we
break.
did census, I was in the numerator. I was in the numerator for the census. One of the questions was, do you own this house or do you rent it? That information of rentals in this city should be available through the census. So that'll tell him how many and maybe even where. So. Okay, I'm gonna hang around and listen to this. I've been to the same council meeting in a month.
Right, I have 8:03. I'm going to go ahead and call this meeting to order. Will the recorder please call the roll?
Counselor Urban,
Here.
Counselor Meredith,
Here.
Counselor Stennett,
Here.
Mayor Silsby.
Here. All rise for the Pledge of Allegiance.
And to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Items to be added to the agenda? I see none. This is a time, appearance for interested citizens. This is a time for citizen comment. The council will first take comments addressing items not listed on the agenda for a maximum of 30 minutes. The council will then take comments addressing action items on the agenda for a maximum of 30 minutes. Individual speakers must be recognized by the presiding officer, provide their name, identify whether they are a city resident, and if so, their ward. Please limit comments to 3 minutes or less with council approval. Comments regarding any matter scheduled for a public hearing may be provided only during that hearing. The council will not make any decisions based on public comment. However, staff and council may choose to ask questions or comment following the conclusion of citizen comments. Art Lancaster.
It's working. First off, garbage, lies, makes Cottage Grove look like bad people. We're not bad people. And the person interviewed in here was a former board member. And that's not good. Okay. That's enough said about that. This is garbage. Houses for rent in Cottage Grove. Recently, I've been trying to find a house for my mother-in-law who's coming down from Alaska to live. I don't know if a lot of you know it, but a lot of the rentals in Cottage Grove are now syndicated. Not owned by people in Cottage Grove anymore. Some of them in Mississippi, some of them in South Carolina, Tennessee. That's not local. Come on. So you've got no recourse. You know, you have to deal with people that you've never seen before, you never will see. And it's pretty sad. And then she was talking about 900 jobs. We also need to figure out, are these going to be full-time jobs? Are these going to be part-time jobs? Cottage Grove is full of part-time jobs. We need some full-time jobs brought to this city. That's going to bring in the people. And the apartments that are being built everywhere in town. What happened to building homes? Cottage Grove has beautiful homes. Old, new, but I haven't seen a home being built in Cottage Grove 15, 20 years since I've seen a new home being built. That's pretty sad. All they're doing is building apartments. We want to keep the small town feeling. If all you're building is up, where'd the small town go? You can't see it anymore through the apartments. Okay.
Thank you. Daryl Dunn. I hope I said that right.
It's David.
David,
Yeah.
David.
I reside in Ward 2. I just wanted to say after almost 2 years of living about 100 feet from the 12th Street former camp that the last few nights have been pretty nice. And I wanted to thank all the city workers and everyone that helped clean up out there. We had quite a battle with the rats out there. There was hundreds of them scattered in all directions. So I'd like to publicly thank them. That being said, it's been kind of nice and see less people wandering around and thing like that. But there's already some problems at the Dusk Till Dawn. There's been harassment of the security guards. I can hear them yelling at them. There's already needles over there, so might have to clean that up too when we're done with that. Just something to think about. But it's been pretty nice, and I just wanted to thank everybody involved. And thank you.
Thank you. Ken Eady.
Hello. I'm a little sad to see that this town would separate itself from some of its community. I never understood how anybody could look down their nose at any one person. You without sin, go ahead and cast the first stone. Saddened by your Dusk Till Dawn, Mayor. I challenge you to get rid of it, because if you don't, you won't have another term. People have reminded you of the golden rule. Apparently, you guys like the gold more than the rule. Thank you.
Thank you. Bonnie Santa.
My name is Bonnie Sano, and my home is a Cottage Grove address. For the benefit of Mike Fleck, if he's listening, and anyone else who questions my honesty in speaking when I don't live within the city limits, let me say clearly, I do not live within the city limits. However, what you do affects everyone beyond the city limits. You talked about advantages and disadvantages. The biggest disadvantage that Cottage Grove has had was the recent homeless camps. And that situation. When the citizens vote to elect people to represent them and their best interests, they expect those representatives to do just that without having to look over their shoulder to make sure that it's actually done. Those who represent them are fiduciaries to the citizens, not to the homeless who want to take advantage of setting up camp in the city. In the light of the recent expanded homeless camps and the very huge, very expensive cleanup of those camps, I would hope that the city of Cottage Grove has learned its lesson. The city basically enabled rather than helped about 80% of the homeless who resided in those camps. Sometimes a person has to hit rock bottom with nowhere to go and no one to coerce or manipulate before they actually want to change. In addition, if the state legislature and the governor pass a law demanding that the mentally ill be cared for, then the state needs to provide the professional care of those mentally ill, not the local citizenry. I would hope that in the future, the city would comply with the minimal requirements of the law regarding the homeless. Then perhaps reach out on a case-by-case basis to help those who actually want to change their situation. One size certainly does not fit all, and you don't need to stoop to the lowest standards, such as low barrier or housing first. Those were stupid standards. And I would like to make another comment real quick. Steinert mentioned internet. I'm wondering if it would be to Cottage Grove's advantage to look into Starlink as a Cottage Grove wide internet service. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Public hearings, I see none. Consent agenda.
Move approval of the consent agenda.
We have a motion with the second. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries unanimous. Resolutions and ordinances. A second vote for ordinance number 3185, amending the Cottage Grove Municipal Code by adding chapter 3.11 regarding the establishment of low-income rental housing property tax exemption program. Community Developer Director Eric Mung.
Good evening. Thank you, Mayor, Council. The Community Development Department brings before the City Council ordinance number 3185 for a second vote and adoption. The first vote on ordinance 3185 occurred on June 10th, 2024. This ordinance, if adopted, will establish chapter 3.11 in the Cottage Grove Municipal Code, creating the low-income rental housing property tax exemption program. It is recommended by staff that the council hold or consider ordinance 3185 for a second vote and adoption.
Councilor Irvin.
Thank you, Mayor. First, I want to acknowledge that I was not present at the first vote of this, so I think a lot of this could have been sorted out probably earlier on, so I apologize in advance. There was one of the things that has stood out to me in this ordinance is the potential for sitting on a property, not developing it, not actually having the net benefit of the intention of this ordinance, in that there's provisions that are allowing for properties that are being held with the intent of developing to the affordable housing standards. Mr. Monaghan or anybody else, could you point me to where the guardrails are in this and how in effect that might be handled? And is that partly the intent of the policy that goes along with this, or is the ordinance itself sufficient to prevent that? And kind of along with those, can we bolster, can we add anything that would put timelines in place for when rentals need to come in or renters need to come in? And then there was kind of a discrepancy, I think, between the policy and this ordinance in terms of the definition of, it might not actually be a discrepancy, but the definition of affordable or low income. I know in the policy it's defined, if we can muddle these two, I hope we can, like we did on Monday.
I'll try
or on Friday. This is setting it at 60% of medium income. And I know that the requirement stated in the ordinance talks about 60% for the first year, and then it drops down to 80% for subsequent years. So if you could speak to those issues.
Mayor, thank you, Councilor Irvin. So to the first one, I did reach out to legal counsel on Friday following the discussion at agenda session regarding that potential position that the city's put in where an applicant comes in meeting the criteria in order to hold a piece of property for future development of regulated affordable housing under the LRPD criterion. According to legal counsel, the provisions that allow all of this to take place out of ORS 307, I believe I can't remember the starting number, but the provision that specifically speaks to this, 307.531, points out that the governing body has the ability to, so the situation, the hypothetical where an abatement is granted, and let's just go with the 20-year that's allowed in the code and statute. And for some reason it changes hands, let's say, or there's a change of heart about it. What does the city do? And so with that, under ORS 307.515 and the definitions therein, and the filing of a termination of the agreement, which happens by the city's part, right?
Is that the process that's initiated by the manager and has to be effectively authorized through the council?
Correct. Okay. Through a resolution similar to the resolution that grants the abatement period. As you've seen under the MUPD program, which is similar in statute, a resolution is what grants the period and sets out the guardrails, if you will. So what they pointed out is that when it's terminated and under those circumstances of failure to develop the affordable housing that was promised and the reason the abatement was granted, then they're put back on the tax rolls, and then at the next tax year, all the taxes that were abated are then applied to the tax bill. So if someone did do that, whether it was an intentional act or some other proceeding that put them in that situation to where suddenly it wasn't going to qualify for LRPD anymore, then that tax payment becomes due. And then as taxes are collected, I mean, obviously folks receive tax bills and sometimes they don't pay, right? But then there's a whole process for what happens in that case. So the city is protected in that way through state law to be able to recoup the monies that were abated through that initial grant.
So if I can follow up on that, I understand that process, and that's great to have the state statute is authorizing that and kind of already built in. My concern is that, and I don't know what the appeals process might be, that if you don't have a clearly articulated set of standards for what it means to hold a property for this purpose, then I would, if I was in that position, I would argue I have met the standard. You don't have grounds to terminate my tax abatement. So what then? And so what in looking at that, I would say, hey, this is roughly what we mean by that. Maybe we expect within a year that, or two, or whatever is reasonable, that you develop or come back to us for an extension and demonstrate that, this authorizes inspections, that you've got a percentage or something of the units rented under the guise of this. It's basically just a way to ensure if the city of Cottage Grove is going to give up this tax revenue, the expectation is that they're voting, that they're expecting is that people are getting, affordable housing, and that we got people in housing now. So I'm looking for more either assurance or additional language that does that. The second point to that, or the second point, that I have issue is the audit. As I'm reading this, it's just 20 years. I'm not seeing that up to 20 years with the discretion of being granted. It looks like just 20. And I seem to remember in the MUPTI that there was intentionally language about I think the council's discretion for how long to grant something. So I wonder if that's going to operate the same.
It is my understanding, and legal counsel's on the call, and they can correct me if I misspeak, but the state statute, just like with MUPTI, allows you to grant, the 10-year period. But it can be less, right? It can be a cap of total abatement value. You could say, we only want to abate 50% of the value, or cap it at 100,000, some number, or only 5 years. With the LRPD, it's my understanding that it is for a 20-year period, so long as they meet those standards. It then becomes just a decision based on the council of whether or not they're meeting their criterion.
But if they fail to meet their criterion, is it an automatic payback of all of the abated taxes back to the time that the application went through? Or say somebody says, I'm going to come in here and I'm going to make this for 10 years. Well, if it's only 20 and then at 10, they drop, we wouldn't want them to be in a situation that.
Right. So I think in the case of somebody coming to the council with an application and saying that they only plan to hold it in this regulated affordable status for a 10-year period, that would be, you would argue that doesn't apply, and it wouldn't be granted in the first place. That maybe utilizing a different mechanism would be the preferred route, such as the MUPTI program, for example. As far as the annual maintenance of the LRPD, it had been a topic, I believe, at the first reading of this ordinance, that it requires annual auditing by city staff. Basically, prove up that you're actually hitting that 60 or 80 AMI, depending on where they're at in their cycle. And then that AMI, of course, is determined by not the city, but by a government entity that says, here's the aggregate data of incomes for your region, and here's what that amount would be. Much like the MUPTI program, the companion document that was adopted when it was amended last year this time, we said that what that looks like is not necessarily looking at what the dollar amount of the paycheck is, for lack of a better term, but saying rents for a 2-bedroom can only be $600 or whatever. And that's based off of the income, of course, but then it's more of a cap on the rents, not a cap on the income per se. It's not what's looked at in the audit. Certainly somebody could have some malfeasance for sure and cook the books, as it were, but I think that that's less likely when you would have that opportunity for the inspections and things like that, because you can always ask tenants what they're paying, things like that. I do think that it's, given the agencies that are involved typically with this type of program, religious institutions, established nonprofit organizations, things like that, they're already being subsidized by other things as well in order to get the rents down to that level. And so it's more than just Cottage Grove needing to enforce. They're being enforced upon in multiple other directions, because they're also receiving probably HUD dollars and things like that, where there's other agencies also looking at their practices and the conditions of the facilities, et cetera. So there's a little bit of insurance to support that effort on the city's behalf. Is it foolproof? Certainly not. I mean, I couldn't tell you that it would never happen that somebody might break the rules, but that's where the termination policy or aspect of the code comes into play, where the council could withdraw that abatement at any time.
And you're saying there's an audit yearly.
Yes, they have to continually prove that they're maintaining it because it wouldn't, trusting, again, to just trust the system to hold to it is probably, would be a fool's errand.
I mean, I'm looking for council's input on this because running a scenario where, you know, an abatement is granted, the property is either purchased or there's a provision for reassignment of an existing property. So say there's an existing apartment complex or something that could be held tax-free without actually anybody getting, you know, low rents under the language of this right now. It's seemingly indefinitely, unless it's just up to the discretion of where that line is. And what I'm asserting is that I think it'd be helpful for us to articulate where that line is, if we have agreement on that it shouldn't be held indefinitely. So where it should be developed in 5 years or 2 years or 1 year,
Reassess.
and that there are people receiving, you know, that subsidy to get into that housing. It's not just indefinitely held.
Ms. Conley?
Oh, thank you. So the council, at the time you receive an application, you're not only applying the code criteria and the resolution standards that you will consider if you have the second reading of the ordinance and move to approve, but each application then is going to be subject to resolution conditions and criteria that you set at the time. It is, you know, absolutely fine to have this conversation now. And if you want to have an ironclad standard, I'm assuming that staff can work with you to implement that. But I would caution you, because each application is going to be different and you might want some flexibility to accommodate this type of property, the applicant, the proposal, et cetera. And all of those conditions could be established on a case-by-case basis.
To clarify, you could not establish a shorter term than 20 years, though. That'd be one.
Right. But you could say what you want to have happen during those 20 years. You don't have to wait till the end of 20 years and then say, oh, they didn't meet our conditions, now we're revoking. And you are entitled then to 20 years of tax revenue. Instead, assuming that, and I have to admit, Armand, and who is an attorney in my office, did the initial review of the ordinance. I'm less familiar than Eric is actually with the program, but I am confident that case-by-case conditions can be imposed.
If I'm, yeah, so just to add on to that, and so our best case analog would be the MUPTI program, where we look at the public benefits that they promise, right? Where they say, we're going to do X in order to qualify for Y. And then we say it's for a 10-year period. When does that begin? So those are the kinds of conditional items that can be built into something. So as I'm trying to think of the different scenarios, and I think Carrie makes a great point about building in some flexibility, and to what I would add more here in a second, but building in some flexibility where you're not making it too exclusive, where it could be that if you don't have it converted, for example, from any, you know, the existing multifamily setup being purchased by an entity that qualifies, but then it takes them 10 magical years to remodel it in the meantime, you know, and they got a benefit while still getting a premium on rents, right? You could say, okay, you're applying for this now, you know, there's a couple options you could take. Convert it first and come to us with a completed product, and then we'll consider that application. Or you could say, you've got 1 year to convert it. How do you know? And our understanding of that is that you're, you know, applying for necessary building permits, paying any necessary fees owed for that process. And the clock starts now. Your first benchmark is proof of conversion. And that may correspond with, say, an annual audit or some other metric, but all that could be a recital in your resolution that is under consideration for that each one. That being said, when staff brought the MUPD amendments to you all last year, one of the things that we wanted to do was to give the council more tools that could be amended more easily, which is why we now have a standards and guidelines document for MUPD as well. And resolutions don't have to go through quite so much of the timing process. So for example, if there's something that's just not really clicking in the provided, the next item on the agenda, should this move forward, then to make an amendment to that, I mean, theoretically, you could write a resolution during a meeting, I mean, theoretically, right, without having to meet those certain charter specifics of, if it's not available for more than 1 week, then it's got to have 2 readings, or it's got to be a unanimous vote, things like that. So if something did come up and it was more prescient to make an amendment to the standard and guideline document, it's not making a code amendment. It's how we implement this larger framework, which is the proposed chapter 3.11.
And so, did that satisfy your, because I think the real danger that Councilor Irvin saw was somebody holding on to the property and say, oh, we lost our grant, we didn't get that, or we're still working on the funding and we don't get to the housing.
I think that there's certainly a certain amount of fair warning that should be offered to an applicant that is in that particular situation where they are seeking to abate the land value at that point, assuming that it would say it was bare land, assuming that they're seeking to abate that, potentially the council could terminate this for failure to perform, meaning X. Now, what I would say is that generally that land value only taxes are significantly less a portion of that assessed value, and therefore maybe not as financially problematic as, say, the conversion option, where it might have significant taxable value prior to the conversion. But again, that failure to perform isn't necessarily the fault of the cities, right? That would be the risk that the applicant is taking. And I don't, as staff, I wouldn't recommend that the council worry about that risk that they're taking, because ultimately the city can recoup any abated taxes for failure to comply or perform.
Councilor Irvin.
Well, with that understanding, move that the council adopt ordinance 3185, which is amending the Cottage Grove Municipal Code by adding chapter 3.11 regarding the establishment of a low-income rental housing property tax exemption program.
We have a motion with a second. Any more discussion? Will the recorder please call the roll?
Counselor Stetman,
Aye.
Counselor Irvin,
Aye.
Counselor Meredith,
Aye.
Mayor Silsby.
Aye. Motion carries unanimous. Thank you. Item B, a resolution adopting standards and guidelines for processing applications for low-income rental housing property tax exemptions. Mr. Monken.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So with the adoption of ordinance 3185, it's now appropriate for the council to consider the standards and guidelines document per ORS 307.521 sub 4. Local jurisdictions shall adopt standards and guidelines to basically build a framework for the policies on how LURPDs are granted and how to process those applications. I think you'll find that largely the standards and guidelines mirror the ordinance at this point. There is some additional definitions, I believe, that are added in there, city manager, where, but the meat and potatoes of this standard and guidelines document at this point in time is really just where do we derive the data in order to calculate what qualifies as being low income. And so I apologize, I don't have a packet in front of me, but I just gonna look and see if the name of the agency, the Oregon Housing Stability Council, and that's based on information from the U.S. Department of Urban Services. Staff recommends adoption of the attached resolution.
Counselor Urban.
Thank you, Mayor. Similar, so I'm taking that understanding that I just acquired, and that your ordinance needs to be as open and flexible as possible, and that you're going to firm things up on an individual basis through the resolution process. I am still interested in seeing something in the standards and guidelines that acknowledge, look, the aim at this is that we're trying to get low income as defined into affordable housing as soon as possible. Something that just, maybe it's acknowledged in the program itself. But when you have the language about holding the property, I think it is necessary to acknowledge it's not just an indefinite holding of this property. It's as soon as you're able to, so that's one point. There's a reference to the city's housing dispersal policy. I think we kind of mentioned that on Monday. I would like to see that. I don't know if that's available. Typically, if something's referenced, I'd like to read that too, because it'll give me more understanding of what we're referencing.
Sure. Mayor, Councilor Urban. So after agenda on Friday morning and this topic coming up, and my conflation of a couple of terms, so I apologize again for that. But so just the dispersal, we would want to look at our comp plan, the city's comp plan, specifically probably the most recent amendment to the comp plan, or the housing portion, goal 10, which would be the housing needs analysis, where it talks about the placement of housing types. Basically, again, the goal being that when you're creating different housing mix, you're recognizing what other factors are influencing in the area. Also looking at not creating, multifamily bill on one corner of town and small or single family dwelling bill on another part of town. Really trying to create that urban mix that is both well suited for transit and access to services. So from a policy position, I would say the best probable resource would be on that dispersal of how we develop housing, looking at our zoning, our comp plan designations would be to look at that goal 10 or the housing element of the city's comprehensive plan. But generally what it says is you want to do higher density development along transit corridors or higher classified streets, which are generally closer to services. Right now, under the City of Cottage Grove comp plan, there are some opportunity areas for amendment in the future. Specifically, some of the actions taken by your predecessors long ago, back in 1981, put a lot of high density residential on the fringe of town. That's not the ideal situation. Generally, when you've got a high density residential situation, it's going to be there's going to be fewer parking opportunities and things like that, and generally you'd want to put those people where they could be having more, I'll say, pedestrian, but not as a pejorative, pedestrian approach to engaging with the community that is walking, biking, or taking local transit, whatever form that might be in. And so I think that would be a good resource for kind of understanding how the city has established its growth patterns and where things should and shouldn't go.
Counselor
Does that
Stennett?
satisfy?
Thanks. It mentions a rent regulatory agreement in a form approved by the city. How does that play out? Do we draft a document that fits our needs and then expect them to produce information, or do we take what they give us and as long as it's satisfactory? Or
Mayor, Councilor Stennett, so I've been working with some other agencies, municipalities that have a LRPD to try and pull together some of the take the Salivar approach, if you will, look at what they have and see what I think would work best to satisfy the information that we need to gather. This language is very similar to the language that was adopted with the MUPD back in 2019, where we have to create a standardized form for the use and consumption of the folks benefiting from the program or applying for the program in general. So really it would just be sorting out those metrics in order to satisfy what council would like to hear or see to ensure that the intent of this code is being met and the intent of the approving resolution, that is the one that specifically granted their abatement, is being met.
Is this resolution 3187?
This will be resolution number 2151.
2151. Counselor Irvin?
How crucial is it to have this passed tonight in relation? Can we continue to work this a bit?
Mayor, Councilor Irvin, I don't ever like to negotiate against myself, but yeah, no, there's obviously no reason to adopt this tonight. I would say that prior to any consideration by this council of an application for LRPD, we still need to go to our partner taxing districts, that is the school district, the fire district in Lane County, to get their concurrence, or at least 51% concurrence with that before an application could be considered. So there's certainly an opportunity for us to do some more workshopping to, whether it's establishment of more clear guardrails, some warnings, maybe even, kind of just going along with that. Hey, if you don't perform, this is what's going to happen, sort of thing. And so, yeah, no, I mean, certainly, if we need to have staff bring it back later with what we've discussed tonight, trying to address that, or maybe perhaps there would be an opportunity if council so wishes to maybe just do some more one-on-one sort of speaking to what some concerns are, and then we can come back for consideration. I really do want to make sure that it does do what you want it to do. I would say, full disclosure, that these standards and guidelines are largely based off of the City of Eugene's program, which has been a fairly reliable program and supported like Square One Villages and some of those projects. I mean, it just is an additional background. To qualify for this program, in general, it's a pretty narrow sliver. The adoption of this program is not going to bring in a land use permit application tomorrow, or even, assuming that all the taxing districts agree to it and whatever else. There's so much of a gap left between just the abatement of these ad valorem taxes and actually putting shovels in the ground to do work. So I mean, there's certainly time. I don't think that there's anything you can do to this document to make it easier, because we're still bound by the constraints of state law that say who can even apply for the program. So there's certainly time. We'll just, need to get good direction, which, we've talked about a couple of things. I'd like to make sure though, that when staff does come back, that we've done our best to kind of consider all the different scenarios, I guess, if we will, best we can, and see if that helps you.
I'm fine with that too. All right.
We're talking specifically time to consult the other taxing agencies. Specifically, you're talking about time to consult with the other taxing agencies and things.
So Mayor, Councilor Stanton, so at this point with the ordinance being adopted, staff can start engaging with those other districts in order to get on their agendas if need be for presentations to them, so that they can understand what it's going to be. Not moving this resolution forward this evening is not going to prevent that process from concurrently happening. As far as how long do I think it will take? The school district and fire district are probably a little bit easier to get in front of as far for their consideration. Like with the MUPD program, the school district, when taxes are evaded, they make up the gap basically from state dollars. The fire district has the opportunity where, of course, they're not getting just the general revenue stream in general, but they can charge for service in the case of an actual need. So I know that helped with that decision making process. And then as far as the Board of Commissioners, I hear that they have a really awesome housing production manager that help them to see the value in this program.
Okay, so we'll wait on that. Councilor Meredith?
Do you have enough direction from?
I think I'm gonna take some of my notes. I'm gonna rewatch the meeting this little bit here. Probably talk to Carrie a little bit just to see what the statute will allow us to establish as far as on the standards and guidelines document, without, because there's that whole thing of add to but not take away and vice versa and whatever else. I want to make sure that I'm not staff isn't bringing something that is dead in the water. But then I really, if I have further questions, if council is agreeable, I reach out to Councilor Irvin. I want to make sure that we can get there.
Because we do have to have it ready by Project Sparrow time, right?
That being said, that particular parcel that may be the candidate for it with that entity, hopefully it's not going to take us 2 to 3 years to get where we need to be.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Mongan. All right. Item D, resolution approving the $3 million grant agreement with Business Oregon for utility infrastructure for a 35-acre housing development in Cleveland Street. Public Works Director, Mr. Stitt.
Right, Mayor, I think you skipped one, but
Oh, I skipped one.
I'll start with that. We can go to
I'm
back
sorry,
to C. So thank you, Mayor. On April 22nd, 2024, the city was notified. The Oregon State Legislature approved Senate Bill 1530, which included a $3 million grant to Cottage Grove to fund utility infrastructure supporting the city's 35-acre housing development off Cleveland Street. The attached resolution prepared by legal counsel approves the grant agreement and with Business Oregon and authorizes the city manager to sign the agreement. So the recommendation is to council to adopt the resolution accepting the $3 million and authorize the city manager to sign the agreement. There's no match that's required with the grant. This is an outright $3 million grant from the state of Oregon to install the water, sewer, and storm infrastructure. The actual street improvements that'll need to be made will be paid for by the city through SDC funds and in partnership with potential developers of the property.
What a blessing. Resolution number.
I've played around with the numbers now.
Sorry.
And that's okay. So we're going to have this resolution be number 2152, please.
2152. Counselor Irvin.
Thank you, Mayor. Just to give credit where credit's, I think, due, I believe this is a $3 million grant brought about by relationships forged by former councilors Savage with Val Hoyle, if I'm correct on that. Is that right?
Mayor and Councilor Urban, that is correct. I worked with Councilor Savage and she worked hard to set up appointments with the governor's office and with Representative Charlie Conrad. And Representative Conrad was the one that worked with the state and the legislature to get it inserted. So yes, Councilor Savage opened the door. We were able to present the need and it was funded.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to share appreciation for those efforts for what it does for this project. And with that, I would move that the council adopt resolution 2152, which is approving the $3 million grant agreement with Business Oregon for utility infrastructure for a 35-acre housing development at Cleveland Street.
Second.
We have a motion with a second. Will the recorder please call the roll?
Counselor Merriday?
Aye.
Counselor Stennett?
Aye.
Counselor Irvin?
Aye.
Mayor Solsby?
Aye. Motion carries. Resolution approving the grant agreement with the Oregon Community Pass Grant Program for the Lincoln Middle School Path. Public Works Director, Mr. Stewart.
Thank you, Mayor. So council might remember back in January of 2023, city staff worked with OCOG staff and submitted an application to ODOT, Oregon Department of Transportation, to their Oregon Community Pass Grant Program to construct a new path along the Coast Fork River in central Cottage Grove, connecting Hayes Avenue to Lincoln Middle School. And in August 1st, 2024, city staff was notified that ODOT has the $339,184 available to fund the project if the city authorizes the approval of the grant agreement. And the way this came about is there was an applicant that was awarded back in 2023 the funds, but wasn't able to proceed with their project and keep it going. So that freed up the resources for them to consider this project. So if council authorizes the approval of the grant agreement, the city is obligated to provide a 30% match, which is approximately $145,365, which brings the total cost of the project to $484,548.60. The match will be provided by the Bicycle and Footpath Fund, and the city will have 5 years to complete the project. And to narrow down, we have 2 years to actually have the construction documents complete and an additional 2 years to construct it. So it's not something that I was a little bit worried about with all the projects we have in the works right now with Main Street getting rolled out, Bohemian Park getting finished and everything else, that we weren't going to be able to proceed immediately. And we have some time to get this done. So the attached resolution was prepared by legal counsel. It approves the agreement with ODOT accepting the community pass grant for Lincoln Middle School path and authorizes city manager to sign the agreement.
Counselor Irvin.
Thank you, Mayor. I move that the council adopt resolution 2153. 1. Oh, back to 1. Okay. Let me amend that. I move that the council adopt resolution 2151, approving the grant agreement with the Oregon Community Paths Grant Program for the Lincoln Middle School path.
Second.
We have a motion with a second. Will the recorder please call the roll?
Counselor Merriday?
Aye.
Counselor Irvin?
Aye.
Counselor Stennett?
Aye.
Mayor Solsby?
Aye. Motion carries unanimous.
Mayor, may I just say another comment, please? So council might know the vision for this is when we purchased this piece of property from Tina McCoy, the vision was for a pathway, and our city staff actually constructed 3/4 of the path along the river. It's a beautiful pathway right now, gravel surface. The vision is to complete that path all the way to 6th Street, which would make the connection to Bohemia Park and the Raw River Trail, connecting folks to the East Regional Park, to North Regional Park, and to Cope Creek. And then recently with the purchase of the Cleveland Street, the opportunity to be able to extend this existing path from Hayes to Cleveland, and with the housing development, this will really move forward that vision. And presently right now, staff's working with LCOG to write a grant to fund the portion from the middle school to 6th Street, and hope to have that submitted by the 15th, which is the deadline. So we're starting to see this actual dream and vision take place. So it's pretty exciting.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Business from the City Council. Item A, proclamation regarding the July 30th, 2024 recall election. Mr. Sauerwein.
Well, good evening, Your Honor, members of the council. This is really a housekeeping item. It's my understanding that it's been the city's past practice, just for the record, to officially note the outcome of the city election. And that's all we're doing with this proclamation.
Item B, 2025-26 League of Oregon Cities legislative priorities.
Well, good
Mr.
evening
Sauer.
again. Yeah, as we discussed on Friday, we asked each of the council members to provide their input to staff of what they consider to be the top 5 priorities for the League of Oregon Cities to focus on during the next legislative cycle. And you have a composite of that in front of you. I just note that in looking at it, I believe the top 5 would probably be under community economic development, infrastructure funding, and shelter of homelessness response. Under general government, behavioral health enhancements. Under transportation, the transportation package, and then also under transportation, community safety and neighborhood livability. So, based on your numbers, that looks like the top 5, but we're still certainly open to suggestions as to what top 5 you would like us to forward on to the League of Oregon Cities.
Concerns from council. Anyone have anything?
I want to speak about our roads. We've heard for years and years from citizens not satisfied with the conditions of our roads. We heard you loud and clear. We formed an ad hoc citizens committee that had members of the council and 8 dedicated citizen members. We were guided by a citizen, Amber Baylor, who did an excellent job keeping us in line, and we met for 10, I want to say 8 or 10 meetings, a lot of meetings. We acquired a huge binder, and in those binders, we looked at every which direction you could about our roads. If you go to the City of Cottage Grove website, find your government, right below it, you'll see mayor and city council, a tab, and right below that is a link to all the materials that we got to look at as well. So it's come out of that work that we did. We try, it would be great if money fell from the sky and magically roads were filled or healed themselves or whatever, but a brief history of the roads is that in 1952, we had less than 5 paved miles of street. The remainder was this wonder product, gravel. And that was one of the options that we actually considered maybe we could go back to gravel, and it would be a beneficial thing in dealing with another complaint, that is people that are speeding through residential areas. So it's not our first choice, but it is an option to return to gravel. The streets will do that if they're not maintained. There was been a number of comments on the cracks, the chip sealing and slurry sealing that's currently being done. People say, why are we just putting a Band-Aid on it? Well, Band-Aids are all we can currently afford, because if you go to the material, you'll see that the gas tax, which has been diminishing over the years, and the state apportionment is not enough to do much more than apply Band-Aids. So it does preserve the roads. It makes them more drivable. Is it the number one solution, ideal solution? No, but it will preserve what we've got. So as you consider, when you receive your ballot, we tried to make it as affordable for the citizens as possible, but we do need additional funding to bring it up to standards, or otherwise. Thank you.
The time is 9:03. I need a council consensus that we can continue. Okay, thank you. Councilor Urban.
Thanks, Mayor. I also reiterate that the roads, we have a decision to make come the next vote. The more information we have going into that vote, the better. So we'll try to coordinate with members of the council to disseminate that information and answer any questions possible, and to kind of answer questions about what this looks like now and in the future, and what else is possible. But I, for one, would like good roads, and I know that costs. And so more to come on that. I think I don't really want gravel. On Monday or Friday, I brought up wanting to revisit our parking study. The time we took it was an interesting data point during the pandemic. And so it like a kind of a standard as she goes study done, and you know, might be some conversation about the intended use of that. So I'll just park that there for you. I'd also like more options. We've done MUPD, FLRPD. There was an option for home ownership. I'd like to see the residents of Cottage Grove not have to play the rental game and feed someone else's wealth, but I'll come into home ownership. See a lot of benefits to that, just in pride of place, the care taken of ownership. I think it's an economic driver. Cascade Home Center, I'm sure, would really appreciate it, and others. So like to see those options. Holte, I think, was one of those. There's some other unique ideas, I think, out there that I'd like to bring for inspection, to see how that fits in with the overall apparatus of what we can implement. I'm wondering if you're going to touch on Bridge Lane presentation. I meant to bring the poster for that event in the Armory coming up in October, where there's going to be some vendors and businesses and education service opportunities put together. So as that approaches, maybe more information, but hopefully that's something that could bring the community out, and get folks connected with employment opportunities as well as other services. I am hoping to hear if there's been any developments of information pertaining to the concerns expressed by constituents regarding Riverview Terrace. So if there's any updates on that, I'm interested to hear. I know conversations have been had, but I'm not sure what the outcome and if there's any resolution that we can work towards. Some more bullet points here. Speaking of projects that kind of go on, there's one on the curves on Gateway Wondering what the status of that, part half or third, I don't know what it is, of the apartments have been built and the others have kind of remained unbuilt, and wondering where we're at with that. I know one of the applicants of the MUPD had requested an extension. I don't remember if it was that one, but I'm interested to learn about that. And then the plug for the city cleanup. I think this goes on with the home ownership thing. I know we're in discussion. Some information has been shared around. So just a primer on that. I think loosely would love to see something initiate in the spring, where we can coordinate different providers, recyclers, garbage service, to be able to say, all right, what do we need in groups of volunteers? How can we come and clear vegetation if need be, to uncover the things that need to go, or shredding day, but just spring cleaning, and try to get into a cadence in the town about that, so expectations can, so people know about it and can expect it and look forward to it and prepare for it. And there's a precedent in Cottage Grove for that from the 30s. 2007 was the last one. All right, so we're due. I also wanted to give the update in terms of the broken windows on Main Street. Was able to talk to Georgia Haskell at the chamber today, and she said, please share this with the council and everyone else here, that half the money, all of it's paid for now. So I want to thank you for the half of the city using the facade grant program, and half of it was picked up through the fundraising efforts of the chamber by citizens like you and I. So kudos. I just want to acknowledge that when talking about the charm of the community, how we respond to just bad situations, says a lot about it. And so that's encouraging to me. And I think Cottage Grove should pat itself on the back for that. And, people do care. We do need these businesses downtown. So pleased with that. And that's all of my chicken scratch. Thank you.
Councilor Merida.
So just a quick aside, I have been speaking with the head of the resident council at Riverview Terrace, and they are working towards a meeting with city officials and to see next steps. But there has been no new incidents. That's a good news. The residents are organizing themselves to record tag numbers and things if there are.
And just along those same lines, Your Honor, the city staff is also standing to meet with the Citizens Council, both the police chief and I. So,
Anyone else? Well, I want to start by saying that a little shout out to Chief Chase, that your officers are speaking very highly of you. And they're saying that you're covering shifts, even working graveyard, you're out on patrol. You're doing something that I think a good leader does, and it's not expecting others to do something you won't. And so I wanted to commend you for that. Also, I wanted to ask about the Armory. And I know that we are looking to make it so it's a little more viable, so it'll start paying for itself eventually, which means probably some different pay structures with that eventually. And one idea that I was thinking about is I think since the citizens paid for this and are continuing to pay for it, I would like to see citizens within city limits to have a more reasonable price, and then people coming from out of our city boundaries, from Eugene or where have you, to maybe pay some sort of an upcharge, and as an idea, just because it's such a jewel for our city that the taxpayers get some sort of reward for helping to pay for that. I also wanted to ask about the noise ordinance after 10 p.m. I know that a lot of the bars and restaurants, they have to cut the music, and I noticed the Armory is not within those boundaries. And so I wonder about a lot of the people, the residential that lives around there and how they're affected. So I just wanted to throw that out there. And I also wondered about alcoholic beverages going in and out of the armory and what our liability is on that. And if you could look into that. And because I know that when people lease it from time to time, they have to, I believe there was some sort of regulation on there that they had to have OLCC, someone with a license, but since I live and work downtown, I see people. And so I wonder about carrying in own alcohol. And so just looking into that. I also would eventually, I understand we're kind of a work in progress here, and like parking in the downtown, I've heard quite a few complaints from business owners, and that people are parking for long periods of time down there. And so if we can get some sort of plan to help those businesses so that we can move parking in and out to alleviate some of the, for their clientele to park there. And then what else? Also, we are going into our election right now, and I just want to really encourage that there were some other people here that I saw that were running for election also that are brand new to it. And I want to encourage that everyone run a clean campaign and that we are courteous and kind to each other. We're a small town. We don't need to do what is happening in our national elections at all. And I would love to see us all kind of work together, stick to voting records, stick to platforms, have people really do their research and not lower ourselves to name calling. And I just think that Cottage Grove is above that. And I really would discourage against that. I mean, growing up in Cottage Grove, some of the things that made it so special for me was our diversity. I mean, they used to refer to us as loggers and hippies, and somehow that worked, and we all got along great. And I have a business across the street that is all self-employed, and it's 21 independent contractors over there, and it's every single walk of life that you can imagine in there, from young to elderly, and it's every political view, and they should not like each other, but they love each other. And I just don't see why we can't get back on that road where we came from. I personally had, when I ran, had some signs, campaign signs, many campaign signs stolen. And I just want to remind people that we don't need to do that. That let's just play nice. We all want what's best for Cottage Grove in the long run. And it's important to me, and I'm sure it's important to all of us, that we don't discourage really good people from running for office because they're afraid to do so, because they, don't want to put their families through that or their friendships through that. So with that, thank you. All right. Business from the city manager. Follow-up discussion of the 2024-25 fiscal year budget.
Well, good evening again, Your Honor, and members of the council. You'll recall at the end of the budgeting process where we had to eliminate almost $1 million out of our general fund to be able to balance the budget. The council asked staff to do really 4 things. First, to schedule a follow-up discussion of the 2024-2025 budget. That's what we're doing this evening. Present quarterly budget updates to the city council, and your first quarterly update will be an October 28th meeting. Work with the city council to develop a long-term sustainable and stable funding plan for the city police department. And I'm hoping that will be a major topic of discussion at your city council retreat after the first of the year. And then also worked with the city council and the Friends of the Library to develop a long-term sustainable and stable funding plan for the city library. And city staff's already started that conversation with the folks on the Friends of the Library, and we're also working with the library staff and hope to come back with some proposals for you. So just to kind of initiate this discussion, there's really two things that I wanted to look at that are within our budget and financial policies, which is kind of the underpinning of how we make our financial decisions. Now, it's my understanding that the financial and budget policies haven't been reviewed and updated, and that's something I'm working with our finance director, finance department on doing. But two that I would just want to highlight this evening, and I know the hour is late, we can have as much of a discussion as you would like to about this, is really our unappropriated ending fund balance policy and our contingency policy. Our unappropriated fund balance is how we continue to pay for things after the end of the year. The idea being that unlike a business that gets its money in on a monthly basis, our general fund gets its largest dump of cash when property taxes are paid in December. So effectively, we need to have enough money in the bank on July 1st to meet payroll for the rest of the year, rest of the calendar year. Our contingency is basically what we use for unanticipated expenditures of a non-reoccurring nature, is what's written in the policy. Essentially things like ice storms or cleaning up homeless camps, so that we have money available. What city staff is going to be recommending is that we increase the minimum that we put into those two funds each year over a long-term period. In other words, currently our unappropriated fund balance is set at a minimum of 5% and our contingency at 3%. We are meeting those standards. We are meeting our own requirements. But over time, we would like to increase those so that we have more savings in our account. Now, that may seem a little counterintuitive when we're talking about cutting the budget. But again, the goal is to try to avoid having the situation that we had this last year. The second item that I'd like to look at within the policies is our revenue policy. And as the mayor brought up earlier, for the community center is specifically called out in the policies. The Armory isn't, so I'm applying this to the Armory as well. Our current policy is that the community center will operate in a manner such that 5% of budgeting operating costs will be financed through user charges. What that effectively means is that we have a 95% subsidy of every time somebody rents or uses the facility, because we're saying that they're only going to cover 5% of what it costs us to provide that service to them. That's a pretty high level of subsidy. I don't think there's anything wrong with subsidizing groups that use the community center or the Armory, but that's a discussion we need to have. Some organizations have adopted what they call a full reimbursement or completely covering for costs through their fees. I don't think we're going to get there. And to the mayor's point earlier, I think that we do need to look at reduced costs, at least at the Armory, for folks who live in Cottage Grove, as opposed to groups, again, hey, that's a really attractive facility to use, guys. I mean, we fill it with folks from literally all over the region because it is a great facility to use. So again, that's kind of where I'd like to start our conversation about the city's budget and financial policies. We can get into it tonight as much as you would like to, or we can save it and we can talk about it when we do our quarterly report on October 28th. But just to give you an idea of, that's really where staff wants to start this discussion.
Councilor Irvin.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm not sure what else to say other than yeah. Those are the areas that we need to address. Was kind of looking to staff for some guidance on what those percentages, or if it should be looked at in terms of percentages or not. But I think you articulated the reality of our situation quite well. We wound up in a shortfall. And so we had to cut to get out of it. We don't want to revisit that pain if possible. And so we have to delicately balance adding to savings, which cost, an opportunity cost for something else.
Exactly.
And getting it in a more healthy position. So there's only so much that can be adjusted, in this. So I guess I came into this going, what do you see as the path forward? What are your recommendations?
Bert and I will be bringing you recommendations for where we would like to get to those percentages, but understand that it's going to take time for us to be able to get there. We need to tie that change in those percentages with finding long-term stable funding for the police department and for the library. And, some of those choices, and again, like I said, I really want to kind of get into this after the first of the year and we have a full council in really a retreat format, but we can look at things like bond measures for law enforcement. We can look at things like law enforcement fees. We can look at, restructuring how our police department functions. The philosophy I think the chief and I are going to bring to you is there are no bad ideas. We're just going to throw everything on the table and have a good discussion. But law enforcement is our biggest expense. That's a good place for us to start. It's also an extremely important expense. The library is a much smaller budget, about $400,000 a year, but there are other ways you can fund your library. You don't have to look any further than Cresswell that uses a district rather than a city fund. Perhaps we can look at a district for the library. There's been some discussion about, if the Parks District were to go forward, whether or not we would tie our library into the Parks District. So again, our approach is there are no bad ideas. I mean, we're gonna have a lot of different things that we could talk about.
Councilor Meredith.
Do you think that as inflation turns downward, that might provide us some relief? Because we were in a high inflationary with increased costs that we didn't anticipate.
If I could predict what was going to happen with the inflation rate in America, I think I'd be doing something different for a living. To answer your question directly, I think it would have some assistance to us, but we still have that structural issue of, the expenses going up and our revenue hitting what I call a crossover point, which we've hit long ago, that it almost becomes a binary decision that you either increase revenue or you decrease the level of service. And, I don't have to tell anyone here, how we do property taxes in the state of Oregon makes it very difficult for cities to keep up regardless of the inflation rate.
Item B, update on homeless camp cleanup.
Well, what we'd like to do this evening is just kind of give you an update on really the costs and the impact that we had of the cleanup that we've done at the Douglas and at the 12th Street. So start with the police chief and just talk about, what has been the impact on law enforcement.
This is not the usual microphone here. Thank you, Mayor, Council, Mr. Sauerwein. Hold this up a little bit so you guys can hear me. So basically, I'm just going to run over some quick numbers about what the cleanup actually looked like for us and kind of the impact to our staffing. So we did plan a pretty significant operation. So we had quite a few people here to help with that. And our goal in helping to shut down those camps was really just to shut them down and to not have any sort of incidents associated with that. We just wanted to make sure that we could get them closed as peacefully as possible and just kind of help to facilitate a peaceful transition out of those sites and make that as seamless as possible. There were 7 of us, myself included. We spent a total of 6 hours, so that of the day of the closure. It's a total of 42 police staff hours. And so, from CSO to officer to captain to chief, so varying expenses related to those. But that was our staff. And so because we brought in our entire staff, we brought in 1 person on overtime, we used everybody that we had available to us with CGPD for that. So we did rely on some mutual aid, and we asked for assistance from the sheriff's office. So they had a sergeant and 2 officers down here in Cottage Grove so they could take our calls for service while we were moving forward with the operation. So, so they were here for that duration. We also just, you know, to be prepared in case there was any sort of incidents that arose during the closure of the camps. Also reached out to the state police to ask them to kind of just be on standby. Really, it was more of just a situational awareness. They do have a trooper that lives down here in our area, so they offered to have him hang out down here for the day as well, and just to assist as needed, either us or the sheriff's office with handling calls for service. The command staff out of the Springfield office, they did come down, which I thought was a very nice gesture. They showed up at Douglas Street, just as you know, just to kind of show their support for us. So we did have a captain and a lieutenant and a sergeant that also came down. So it was a lot of staff and a lot of resources. I think the end result was what we were looking for, which was the ability to close the camps and to not have to have any enforcement action taken, but to do it as peacefully as possible. And that's what we ended up doing. So shout out to the Lane County Sheriff's Office for sure, and the Oregon State Police. We built some really strong partnerships with them in the time that I've been here. And whenever we have needed them for whatever it is, they've been willing to step up and help us out. So I also just want to share some quick numbers just as kind of as an overview. Just at the 12th Street site, for the 2-week period leading up to the closure, we responded or had 14 calls for service at the site. The 2 weeks after the closure, that number was at 9. So still getting calls there during that initial 2 weeks, which we kind of knew we would. During that, the cleanup phase that was going on, and there were still people kind of hanging out in the area. And so there were some things that we were called to there. Douglas Street was a little bit different. So there were 16 calls for service leading up to the 2 weeks prior. And then there were 14 calls 2 weeks immediately after the closure. So roughly the same. And then we were able to go back out there last week and facilitate the rest of the cleanup of that site and really securing it. And so we did have some help from One Security on that. And then also Phase team at Public Works was right there behind us to make sure that everything was kind of cleaned up. And so that is now closed. It's appropriately signed. There's visual barriers there. So the site is, you know, for all intents and purposes, secured and appropriately marked. So so that's where we're at with those two sites now. And just for kind of a reference point, our overall calls for service, because I looked at just total for the city, for the police department. So the overall calls for service, we were just about taking the same amount of calls for service in the city 2 weeks prior to and 2 weeks after. With one significant difference is that we took just about 25 more calls for service related to illegal camping and things of that nature that we directly could tie to the illegal camping. So so as that was increasing, once the campsites were closed, you know, we would have folks, you know, setting up illegal camps around the city that we were being called to respond to. So we did respond. To my knowledge, there weren't any calls that came in that we weren't able to respond to, but it did take away from our ability to do other things. That's why, even though the call for service level was the same, there was just kind of an increase in the call type that we were doing and the work that we were doing. So a couple of things that we're doing to help alleviate that, because as you mentioned, Mayor, and I appreciate the positive feedback and the kind words. We are still pretty short on staff. I've been working shifts as best I can to fill in. So For some of these things, what we're doing, we have an online reporting system that I talked about, several months back. So we're adding, I just worked with the site developer for that to get our site updated. We're adding a couple of online reporting options on there so folks can go online and report either trespassing, illegal dumping, or illegal camping. And so as those things pop up, if they go online and report those will be looked at every 24 hours. So we'll have our community service officer who comes in the morning to review those, and on his days off, we'll have another officer or supervisor review those. So we will still get those calls, but it'll help kind of free us up a little bit to not just be reacting to those throughout the day. So that's one of the things that we're going to look at. And I know we heard that there had been some increased activity at the 12th Street camp, and that is true. We've responded a couple times over the weekend to some disturbances there at the temporary site at the dog park. So and those are in the late hours when it is open for occupation. So our officers have been mindful of that. They've responded appropriately and have handled those calls for service. So I think what I saw was 2 or 3 over the weekend. So those are coming in still. So that's all I have. So any questions, comments, feedback?
Any questions? No? Thank you, Chief.
All right, thank you.
All right, also ask Faye Stewart, our Public Works Director, to give you an update on what the cost has been for the cleanup.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. Can we just extend the meeting? We've hit our 30-minute extension deadline. I didn't want to interrupt anyone.
Thank you. Can we have a consensus? Yes. And before we get into that, we had one more concerns of council that we forgot. So Councilor Irvin.
Yeah, I'm sorry for forgetting that. But we met as a committee, Mr. Mary Day and the mayor and I, chaired by the mayor, to interview an applicant for the Planning Commission. We have a recent vacancy on that for a term ending December 31st, 2025. So you're pleased to make a motion to appoint Jill Hermanson to that vacant Planning Commission seat.
We have a motion with a second. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries unanimous. Congratulations.
I want to say thank you for applying, and for all who would think to apply. We need people to apply to these volunteer positions, and so we're very grateful when we get that. So I want to say thank you.
Hey, Mayor. So this is a update on the time and resources that Public Works has spent on the cleanup and closure of the 12th Street and Douglas campsites. So on August 22nd, after the sites had been secured and the law enforcement had encouraged everybody to leave, our Public Works staff immediately went to securing the 12th Street site, repairing some damaged fencing and locking the gates. And then on the Douglas Avenue site, we installed some temporary fencing. And on Friday the 23rd, we had Swanson's Pest Management come and start addressing the rat infestation that we had. And then on August 26th, we started at the Douglas Avenue site. On the 26th and 27th, Public Works staff with 2 backhoes, excavator, and 3 dump trucks removed during that period of time 82.5 tons of solid waste, taking it to the Short Mountain landfill. On August 27th through the 29th, and then followed up on the 4th and 5th, the Public Works crew started working at the 12th Street campsite, where we removed 122.36 tons of solid waste and delivered it to Short Mountain. Then on September 5th, the Public Works crew has started to remove the approximately 3 inches of gravel from the 12th Street site, trying to remove all the remaining small pieces of garbage and contamination that took place. We've started in the essentially northwest corner of the site and pretty much have removed that area. We'll refill that rock and get it compacted, and then we're going to put up temporary fencing there and transition the Dusk to Dawn campsite to that location. We're shooting for 5 to 6 campsites right now to match the need that's been established over the last couple weeks. So just as costs, in our iWork system, we kept track of all the equipment that we used and the employee time. So the employee time to date through September 5th was $10,207.07. Our equipment cost was $13,580. The landfill costs, so the landfill and Swanson Pest, I would share our actual unbudgeted funds that we spent and will be either spent from contingency or general reserve. The landfill cost to date was $20,667.88, and the Swanson Pest invoices to date has been $475 for a total of $44,929.95. I would share that this does not include the assistance that Public Works gave to the police department late last week on Douglas, where there was folks that were camping on kind of both sides along Douglas Avenue between railroad tracks and the road. And then there was a small strip of ground between the construction fencing. Once the police department had secured that site and moved those individuals on, our Public Works crew came in and essentially was able to throw away the stuff that was garbage, and we have stored in storage containers the items that need to be kept for the 30-day period. So our staff is working very hard and doing excellent work. I would hate to even imagine what it would cost to have had those 200 and some tons removed by a contractor. The second thing is I know that one of the residents that were here that lives next door to the 12th Street, Mr. Dunn, that was here, he actually took a couple days off from work as we were cleaning up the facility and removing the garbage because the rats that were still alive were leaving the 12th Street site and finding new homes, and they were there trying to protect their property from them coming onto it. So it was really not a very good situation, and I'm pretty proud of the employees for the hard work and what they dealt with to get to this point. So big kudos to the staff.
We want to extend our appreciation too. I know that city staff didn't sign up to do that job, and so I have great appreciation for all the hard work. Thank you.
I can't begin to tell you how much I appreciate the work that was done by our Public Works employees. Especially, I appreciate their attitude that they were doing this because this is the community that they work for and the community that they really want to continue to support. As you say, this was probably not included in a job description, but it was definitely something that they went at hammer and tongs to get the job done. And I really appreciate them doing it. And I have just one final item. Had a couple of questions from folks about our local voters guide. As we discussed from back when we were doing the budget, the city will be putting out a local voters guide for with information on candidates for the city council and for the mayor's position, and also our local ballot measures. And our city recorder is working on that, and more information to come. And that would conclude my report, Your Honor.
Thank you. Report from city attorney.
Well, it's been a joy to tune in this evening. The city manager and I have a couple things cooking. but nothing is ready to take out of the oven and talk to you about yet. So I'm just gonna postpone any report for the evening and let you conclude before we need to extend again.
Yeah, thank you so much. Oh, Mr. Stewart.
If I don't mind, I'd like to give just a brief little update. Today, our contractor Sierra Santa Fe started chip sealing the streets. By end of day today, they had half the golf course, everything on the east side of the golf course was had 2 applications of the chip seal. My understanding is they may have equipment breakdown at the very ends, but if that gets repaired, they expect to have that west side completed tomorrow. And then we'll be ready at the golf course for the sealant the following week. Weather permitting, right now, they can't apply any sealant if it's raining or moisture. So we'll work that in. It looks like right now, maybe one day there may be moisture predicted. As far as streets, today they were able to chip seal Gateway. They were also able to do the first pass on, these are just first pass. They're actually scrub seals on Gateway, North 16th, and also R Street. Tomorrow they will circle back and do Whitaker, Thornton, and River Road. And then weather permitting Wednesday, Thursday, they'll do it all one more time. So there'll be 2 coats of chip seal, and then everything will get that Onyx scrub seal next week. I have been kind of following some comments on the Facebook, and I really appreciate Councilor Merity talking about, this really isn't the preferred fix, but it actually buys us 10 to 15 years. I'd like to point out, as I did on the radio station this morning, that this $800,000 that we're spending today and really extending, improving the rideability and extending the street life upwards to 12 to 15 years. If we were to take those resources, we'd be able to have done one paving job, which would be Row River Road from Thornton to in front of the car dealerships to East Side Market. So we're getting a lot more, I think, bang for a buck and trying to preserve as much as we can. The only word of caution I'd like to share is that if you drive over black material, that is fresh oil, you might get some on your vehicle. So please just stay in the gravel. Try not to drive your wheels, because when they do one pass, there's going to be a little strip of black material there, the binding agent that they put down. And if you get into that, it is liquid and it will splash up. So just really be mindful and try to encourage that. It is water soluble. So if you get there, you can get it off your vehicle before it hardens with soap and water. And you can also use WD-40. So, but it's going well, and I haven't heard of too many conflicts to date. So hopefully it'll just continue the rest of this week and into next week.
Well, thank you, Mr. Stewart. All right, with that, we are adjourned.